right. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Popular Music Books in Process series, a joint project between the U.S. chapter of the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Pop Conference. I'm Alex Veazey, one of the series organizers, along with Eric Weisbard, Carl Wilson, Gus Statler, and Elena Razlogova. Our other organizers, Kimberly Mack, Antonia Randolph, and Francesca Royster, are currently on sabbatical from their work with us. You can find our whole calendar on the IASPM website under the Journal tab, and you can also catch up on videos of all of our past sessions on Eric's YouTube channel, including our latest session with Glenn McDonald and Carl Wilson about Spotify and streaming music. We will return next Tuesday, October 15th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Trisha Romano will be discussing her new book, The Freaks Came Out to Write, The Definitive History of the Village Voice, the Radical Paper That Changed American Culture, with Michelangelo Matos. But today we're going to talk about band people, specifically the side musicians, the hired hands, the folks who fill out the rhythm and horn sections, the backup singers, the consiglieres, the accompanists, and the composers. Our guest, Franz Nicolay, is a band person. He is also the author of Band People, Life and Work in Popular Music, which UT Press published last month. Nicolay is joined by journalist Steven Hyden. And let me give you some background information on today's presenters. Franz Nicolay is a musician and writer living in New York's Hudson Valley. He was a member of World Inferno Friendship Society, is a member of the Hold Steady, and has played with several other acts. His first book, The Humorless Ladies of Border Control, touring the punk underground from Belgrade to Ulaanbaatar, was named a season best travel book by the New York Times. His second book, the novel Someone Should Pay for Your Pain, was called a knockout fiction debut by Buzzfeed, and it was named one of Rolling Stone's best music books of 2021. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Slate, the Paris Review Daily, the Kenyon Review Online, Plowshares, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Threepenny Review, and elsewhere. He received fellowship residencies in composition at the Renzing Art Center and writing at the UCross Foundation, the Edward F. Albee Foundation, and Art OMI. He has taught at UC Berkeley and in Columbia University's MFA Fiction program and is currently a faculty member in music and written arts at Bard College. And we are also joined by Steven Hyden, who is the author of 6 books, including the recent There Was Nothing You Could Do, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA and the End of the Heartland, and the best-selling Twilight of the Gods. His writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Washington Post, Billboard, Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, Grantland, The Ringer, the AV Club, Slate, and Salon, and he is currently the cultural critic at Uprocks. During our conversation, please post your questions as you think of them in the chat. In the last part of the session, Carl Wilson will call on you to unmute and ask your questions during the Q&A. And of course, we also encourage you to use the chat for comments and conversation, but we will ask the presenters to ignore the chat during their discussion, and we'll send them a copy of the chat transcript later so that they won't miss anything. And now I'm happy to turn things over to Franz and Steven.
All right. Well, Franz, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to you about this book. It's very interesting. Should also shout out, as we did in the intro, this is your novel. Came out a few years ago. Very good book. And I was thinking of your novel actually as I was reading this book because I feel like in both instances, even if I knew nothing about you, I would guess that these books were written by a musician because there's something very inside about them. In this new book, I mean, there's almost like a sociological aspect to what you're writing. And, you know, I think a critic or a journalist could have written this book, but I don't think that they would have thought to do it. I think you need the experience of someone like yourself to conceive of a book like this. And I was wondering if you could talk about being a musician and also being a writer and how being a musician informed your writing in this book. Because, like, on some level, were you thinking, I want to write a book that like a journalist or a critic wouldn't write? Like, I want to maybe kind of remedy things that I've seen written before and maybe bring a different perspective. Like, was that something you were conscious of, I guess, as you were conceiving this?
Well, I just think the incentives are different. Both. It's interesting that you pair this with the novel because both of those books had their genesis in a period of time where I had come off the road for the first time in my adult life, essentially after 15, almost 20 years of trying to establish a kind of momentum and a career, and for various reasons, the birth of my daughter, my family moved to a rural location. It all came to a stop, and I was sort of in a situation where I was being introduced to a lot of new people, meeting people, and you have people ask you these questions. What do you? Oh, they're being friendly. What do you do? And for up until that point, I would have said with some pride, I'm a touring musician, and I was in a position where at that point where that definition didn't apply anymore. So on the one hand, it's a moment of crisis. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for perspective to look back and say, what what was this enterprise that I was engaged in for the last 15 years, for the entirety of my adult life up until this point? I recognize myself as part of a particular community of musicians. We recognize each other. Within this institution, this bizarre institution that we call the rock band that's existed for 60 some years. But it's not usually discussed in terms of work, or as a community of workers, for all kinds of reasons, which we can get into. But it's not, I wanted to sort of take the opportunity to think about what that community was. How do we define ourselves? What are the skills of that community? What are the dignities of that community, and what are the indignities of that community? If you think of it as a guild, what are the foundations of that guild pride?
Yeah. And I'm curious about like your path as a writer, because you said these two books were conceived during a time like where you weren't on the road. Is that the beginning of you writing about music, or had you done that like as a younger man, like or another part of your life, or is that like a more recent thing for you?
No, I had been doing that all along. I'd been keeping, very detailed tour diaries for years. But the early years of touring, there's other things that take up your time. But then, after you've gone to the same cities over and over again, those things become less interesting. I started, right. You have a lot of downtime. You're staring out the window of a moving vehicle a lot. You can assemble a lot of driving montages. It's no accident that my first two books have a lot of driving montages. But I was also looking. I was going to going to a lot of used bookstores. I was particularly buying memoirs by old show business figures and vaudevillians, turn of the century, to sort of contextualize my experience in a lineage of performers outside of rock history. To say, the idea of the touring band doing one-nighters didn't begin in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s or the 50s, but in fact, there's a continuity with vaudeville and commedia dell'arte and all these people who could go town to town, on a train, or singing for their supper. And that was allowing me to sort of, again, like feel a sense of dignity about what I was doing, that I was part of a longer lineage. And so, yeah, I just started writing things along those lines, and as anybody does when they're trying to establish themselves as a writer, like publishing short pieces, publishing longer pieces. Eventually, it felt like it was time to take on a book-length project, and that became my first book, The Humorless Ladies of Border Control. And then when I came off the road, I had been touring with bands for some years, and then I was doing really intense solo touring for 5 years, and then I sort of stopped, and it was a question of and I had started adjuncting at Bard. And so it was a sort of a question of what's the second half of my professional life gonna look like? Maybe the music part is done and the second half is gonna be writing and teaching. And that's when I really knuckled down in a serious way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting reading the book because there's obviously journalism in the book because you're interviewing musicians about their experiences, but there's also a lot of deep like analysis and breaking down like how bands work. And I want to talk about that in a minute because that's some of the stuff I'm most interested in. But I know like for me, in my experience, like interviewing musicians, that the musicians who like to use or like will use their analytical brain, at least in public to the media, like there's not that many. Like I find that musicians sometimes don't want to go there. At least again with the reporter, it might be different if they're talking to other musicians. But there is an element, I think, sometimes when you interview musicians that of wanting to preserve the romance maybe of like what a band is, or like this idea of like writing being something that you sort of you have your antenna up and God dictates songs to you and you are communicating that kind of way rather than talking about it like work. Um, for you, like, is there any tension between like the creative artist brain and the analytical brain? And is that something you've had to resolve, I guess, like as you proceed as a writer in
For me,
this?
there isn't any tension, and I have a lot to say on that topic, as you might imagine.
Yeah,
I think part of the distinction that you're drawing among the people that you're talking to is the distinction between the songwriter front person who has an incentive to maintain a kind of mystique and a kind of magical thinking, um, and the people who are executing and supporting that vision, right? Who might have a more artisan craftsman take on it, who tend not to be the people who are giving interviews in a record cycle, right?
right.
Um, but then there's also, personally, I think of it, and it's a people really do have a kind of magical thinking around songwriting in a way that they don't necessarily around fiction writing or poetry, I think, or visual art. And I've found this in trying to run songwriting workshops in the same way that you might run, a photo crit or a poetry workshop, that people are very resistant to getting under the hood of songs. That some that to that they'll ruin it, that they'll break it, whatever it is. And my take on it is always, or you'll sometimes this will come up around musicians who are insecure about the fact that they don't know music theory. And my position on this is music theory, or like knowing how to take a song apart, knowing how to analyze a song, is a tool, like any other tool, and it's a tool that you can use when your inspiration fails you, or as a check on the limits of your inspiration, right? A lot of people left to their own devices will write the same kind of song over and over again because it's their core competency. It's their comfort zone. And if you have any interest in keeping yourself from repeating yourself, an ability to go back and look at what you've done is a really valuable tool, you know, to be able to identify your own tropes. And so if you're going to go back to those tropes, whether it's like a particular chords that you go to for a turnaround, or particular kind of pet words, pet phrases, pet rhyme schemes, that you're doing them sort of consciously. And the other thing is that it can do you know, is help you write others. I mean, on a very basic level, write more sections to your songs. Most people can come up with a verse and a chorus pretty easily. And I find a lot of time with songwriting students, there's a real resistance to writing bridges. And I have sort of this, again, this like craftsman's appreciation for the bridge. And how do you know where to go for a bridge, for a third section? Well, you look at where you've been, right? What keys have I been in? What keys could I go to? What 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 grammatical form have I been using that I could switch up for the bridge? What question has the verses and choruses been asking that the bridge could give a counterpoint to? And similarly in writing, to look at an essay or a short story and say, I have this sort of felt sense that this thing works. You don't have to stop there. You can say, why does it work? And of course, then what can I steal? What can I bring back to my own writing? Like, what is the thing that this Eve Babbitt's essay, which appears to be, rambling and sort of stream of consciousness, but actually feels like it holds together. Oh, there's these themes, there's these little seeds that she's dropping all along the way. It's, and it demystifies the process in a way that I think is really, there's a lot of educators here, right? Like that, the demystification of the process is a great pedagogical tool.
Yeah. And
And it's
what
a, and it's a, and it's some, and you can, sorry to interrupt, but and it's also, I try to convince other artists that it's a tool against writer's block.
right.
Um, because of that demystification, you don't actually have to sit around waiting for the lightning bolt to strike you, or
Right.
feel panicked if it's not.
Right. Yeah. And like I know, like when I interviewed Jeff Tweedy recently, like because you wrote a book about songwriting, and he was talking about that it's
Mm.
something that you work on every day as you would any other kind of writing, and you chip away at it. Sometimes it will be good, sometimes it won't, but you kind of work on it and make it better over time, as opposed again to having the antenna up and God communicates you this song or whatever. Um, you also go deep into bands and how they work,
Yeah.
as you could tell from the title of the book. I mean, one of my favorite chapters is the social lives of bands, because I'm fascinated by
Mm.
bands. I've written a lot about bands, but as a critic, I'm writing about it from the audience's perspective, and I'm usually writing about like what is it about seeing a band on stage that sort of fires up people's imaginations, and like what do we see in this? What are we projecting onto this band that's meaningful to people? And you're writing about it from the opposite direction, which is very much sort of inside the band, how it works for musicians. And again, it's a very fascinating way, the way you break this down, talking about like does democracy work in bands? Like what is the dynamic between like a front person and a guitar player? Why are bass players always supposed to be deferential and quiet? All these things that I just found to be really fascinating. I want to dig into that, but I'm curious because I'm sure your own experience in bands informed this book, but you're not writing about your own experiences really. And was that something you decided early on? And why did you make that decision?
It was something I decided early on, and it was a decision that I had to defend vigorously over the process of making the book. I had an agent who was really pressuring me to move to make it more of like a gossipy, score settling of, because there's this enthusiasm to get, support musicians talking shit about their more famous band leaders, and that was really not the book I wanted to write. But I also, there was at many points people wanting me to put more of myself in it, and I was also really didn't want to do that because um, part of the project of the book for me was this process of like looking back at my own experience and thinking about how I did things and how I could have done things differently and how other people have approached similar situations, and to get this sort of breadth of opinion that wasn't dominated by my experience. So it was like convening a focus group of my peers that I could learn from as much as anything else.
I
I
mean,
mean,
did you?
obviously,
Oh, go ahead.
anyone who's going to pick, I think most people who are going to pick it up are going to be reasonably familiar with my CV, or they can look at the back flap. So I felt like I didn't need to overemphasize that.
I mean, did you find talking with other people that their experiences jived with your experiences? That, like, when they were talking, for instance, about bands where it's more of a democracy, each person has one vote, versus bands that have one person who's clearly in charge. Um, and because there's like a range of different opinions that you get from people in the book. But did you find that that you were kind of on the same page with a lot of people, or were you surprised by what people were telling you? Like, because maybe it contradicted with your own experiences.
I was surprised. If I had any surprise, it was how willing people were to talk about some of the stuff. Because you could see a situation, and I approached every interview saying, "Hey, this is not we can go off the record at any point. We can anonymize at any point. I know this is we can get into some sensitive territory, but for the most part, people were very happy to talk about any aspect of their interpersonal relationships, their financial relationships, and I have a couple theories on why that might be. In terms of the breadth of opinion, I don't think I was surprised by that, um, as much as I was surprised by how how confidently people, different people, were sure that their directly opposed opinions were self-evident, if you see what I mean. So for some people to talk about like, is live performance different than playing on stage? I got just as many people saying, obviously there's no difference, as I got people saying, obviously they're completely different. Um, Similarly, with the question of um, this is a slightly more subtle question, but it was the question of how comfortable people felt putting their, the cliches are like putting your stamp on a song versus serving the song. Like how much leash do you feel like you have to bring bring your voice to an arrangement, or also um, to also um, uh, uh, to bring a transformative part to a song. And then the follow-up question, it was, you know, is that a direct line from a more confident, cocky young person who wants to, leave their muddy footprints all over their song, to a more, I assumed that it might be that, to a more, humble, tasteful, older musician. But just as much, it was the insecure younger musician who comes into a realization of the confidence um, that people were calling on them to bring their own voice to bear on arrangements.
Yeah. Did you land in any particular place as far as like what is the most functional way for a band to run? Because again, you're talking to different people, they have different takes, they're in different
Mm.
situations. I mean, it seems like a common theme is that if people know what their role is and there's
Yes,
like clarity, that would you say that's the thing that a band needs to function?
I think that was 100% the takeaway, is that clarity about roles and hierarchy, and who exists where in the band hierarchy is. If everyone knows and accepts their and is comfortable with their role, that's when the band is going to function the easiest, and that may seem obvious, right? The trick is that not all bands, a band is this funny combination of small business, creative collaboration, chosen family, but that often convenes before, when its members are too young to know any better, and before they have any sense um, of what the stakes are going to be. And like any long-term partnership, any long-term romantic partnership, like people change, right? Circumstances change, outside pressures come in. And so you can have an understanding of a band when you start the band, but that understanding has to change at various points. And it's those transition points, those inflection points, that I think are the most dangerous. Like a lot of people say, democracy in a band is great. Everybody should, like you should do it when you're young, right? That's your first band should be a democratic band. But but unfortunately, since it can't work in the long term, it's better to have a leader with a clear vision. But it's that transition, right? If the young band that's a democracy has to become the band that has a hierarchy, is where I think people run into trouble.
Yeah. Um,
And
one
both can be the same, right? So like look at, I talked to Joe Lally about Fugazi, right? This is a band that was very protective of its democratic nature internally. But from the outside, right, what's the Hard Times headline? Season 3 of Serial to identify other members of Fugazi, right? There's all this pressure from the press and from outside to create a hierarchy in which Ian Mackay is the guy, and then there's a couple other folks, that's like that takes a lot of strength internally to preserve the structure that you have, or that
you
you
know,
want to have.
one question I get a lot is about the prominence of bands with a band identity in today's like sort of pop landscape. Because, there are
Mm.
bands that are like the Rolling Stones or the Hold Steady or the Beatles that, they have a band identity. Like we think of them as like a five-piece or a four-piece band. And then you have artists who have backing bands, but they're a solo artist. Like Taylor Swift has a band, but she's a solo artist. And the way the pop music has been, at least it feels like for the past 20 years, that bands with band identities still exist. There's a lot of them, but they don't reach the top. That at the very top now, it's solo artists, and not just in rock music, but like country music, R&B, hip hop. Like in the 90s, there were a lot of big groups across all genres, and now it's like you never see groups ascend to that level. And I'm wondering, why do you think is. Do you have any thoughts on that? Because I
Um,
feel like I get asked that question. I have theories on that. I was wondering if you've ever thought about that.
I don't have a grand unified theory on that. You could say something about like the rise of home recording, making it easier for one, person to be the driver of a musical project. It's way easier to do that than to get people with a bunch of gear in a garage. You could say that from a marketing and industry point of view, it's just easier to handle um, a solo artist and mold them. If it's much easier for a solo artist to pivot, right? The people that we look at, even through rock history, as these chameleons who reinvent themselves. Well, it's like, yeah, David Bowie and Bob Dylan can fire their band and hire a new band if they want to change their sound. Like the bands that actually are able to pivot with the times, it's a real leap of faith to get, you know, every member of U2 on board with the project to change their sound, or every member, or Radiohead, or bands like that. So their bands are less nimble in that way. Um, yeah, I don't have like I said, I don't have a grand unified theory about why the most recent stadium rock bands are 30 years old.
Right.
But
Because
it's a
it does seem like there's something in the public where what we sort of connect with as an audience, it's not that band identity. It's like connecting with a person versus like a four or five headed person. At least again, at the top of the, because again, there's tons of bands. It's not that bands are going away, but that as like a, you know, chart topping entity, it doesn't seem, that seems to have been phased out. I just find that to be really interesting.
I mean, maybe there's also something there about like what sounds like the future. And we're probably in a time where the thing that sounds like the future is synthesized sounds and, vocal transformations and all this stuff that's much more native to the laptop than to a rehearsal space.
Like from the musicians that you've talked to, do they do they feel a difference between like working in a band that is supporting an above the line solo artist versus working in a band that has a band identity? I mean, is there a difference from a musician perspective, or is a gig and maybe it's not as important behind.
100%. And that's why I felt like the first thing I had to do in this process and in the introduction is taxonomize. Like, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about hired guns? Are we talking about session musicians? Are we talking about, you know, are we going to talk about string quartets? Are we going to talk about, hip hop crews? Like, where are we going to draw the boundaries around for the purposes of this book around what a band is? And there's some of most of those things. I do talk to, a guy who moved from being in a band to being in, an LA songwriting hired gun. I talked to some Nashville folks. I talked to some, from people who, are basically jazz musicians, but support singer-songwriters here, like singer check writers, as I heard someone call it once. But, primarily what I find the most fascinating is the people who do identify as part of a collective enterprise, both because that's most interesting interpersonally, and how those hierarchies are negotiated, and financially, and how these groups have to grow together, but also because if people who are hired by a solo songwriter, or de facto, like Wilco, right, is presented as a band, but it's a de facto songwriter with people that he hires to play his songs as part of the band. There's a much more clear-cut relationship there, right? Your employer employee, as opposed to a situation where you may have someone like Jeff Rosenstock and has John DiDomenici, who's been his bass player since they were teenagers. They were in a ska band together. They were in Bomb the Music Industry together. Now they're in the Jeff Rosenstock group together. They've grown, or what James Bowman used to be with Laura Jane Grace and Against Me, like childhood friends, start a band, democratic band, but then there's a different relationship that emerges. Mike Campbell and Tom Petty is sort of the iconic example of this, right? And some people can, and that's a really fascinating psychological transformation, and that some people can manage and some people can't.
Well, yeah, like with Tom Petty, he has Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers records, and then he has solo records, but like Mike Campbell and Ben Montench are like with him pretty much on every record, whether it's a solo record or a band record. I always find that to be an interesting thing because it's like, what's the difference at that point?
The difference is the explicitness of who's in charge, right? Talking to however many band people I talked to, which was many, there are a couple bands and a couple that come up over and over. They exert particular fascination, right? And Petty and the Heartbreakers and the Beatles are really important ones because this, for people who are interested in the story of the Heartbreakers, it exemplifies a lot of these tensions, these tensions of an emergent star, of management coalescing and producers coalescing around that person and creating a sense of distance, of Campbell, who can make his accommodation with being the loyal lieutenant, and Stan Lynch, who can't, who's like, I thought this was a band, I can play whatever drum part I want to because I'm the drummer in this band. It's the same way like when people watched Get Back, and saw the Beatles not as these demigods on Mount Classic Rock, but it's like, oh, it's just another band in the room trying to write songs together. And so all of a sudden you have these templates that you can project your interband relationships on. So obviously the John and the Paul, but more to the point for this book, if you're a support musician, are you George, with your nose pressed up against the window of this core songwriting partnership that you can never truly be a part of? Or are you going to be the loyal, sweet, supportive, Ringo? People are looking, I think, in the same way that I was looking to vaudeville, people are always looking for ways to make sense of what their role is as, for the people that I'm talking to here, adults in their career. Right. It was part of the reason it was so interesting to talk to some of these people who often opened their conversation by commenting on the fact that they had never been interviewed before or had so rarely gotten a chance to talk about this stuff. Is that these are adult professionals, 10, 15, 20 or more years into their career, who are living in these very siloed worlds, in which they don't have the opportunity to talk to their peers about their working lives are few and far between because they don't see them very often, right? Like you're a bass player, your opportunities to talk to other bass players at a band at a similar level are sort of limited to, festival catering, or maybe you are on a package tour for a certain period of time, but then you won't see that person for a year or two or three. And so I think the opportunity to compare notes among people who have, as anybody does about their job, right, has thought, after they've been doing it for a while, has a lot of thoughts about it, and want to share those, and can often be pretty articulate about those thoughts because they've been storing them up for a while.
I wanted to circle back to something you were saying about Wilco earlier, because it made me think about sort of the symbolic nature of a lot of bands and how they present to the audience. Like you were saying that Wilco essentially is a songwriter backed by a band, but it's not Jeff Tweedy. It could be called Jeff Tweedy, but it's called Wilco, and Wilco has a band identity. And it feels like that has become the increasingly common thing with bands, where there's a clear person who is in charge, and they may be transparent about the fact that they work in the studio largely by themselves, but then they play as a band, and the band members are not hired guns. It's always the same people, but you also know that they're not necessarily working on the records. Like Tame Impala being an example. War on Drugs has been like that to some degree. Vampire Weekend has been like this to some degree. I mean, there's numerous examples, and there's bands too that started on Bandcamp, one person, and then they kind of became bands once they were big enough to be able to go on the road, like Car Seat Headrest, Snail Mail, groups like that. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, like, why is there a need to present as a band even if people may know that you're not working as a band in the sort of traditional sense? Is it sort of a symbolic thing with an audience and even with the artists themselves that this is an archetype that has power and it means something other than just being a songwriter backed by musicians?
Yeah, I do think that. I think a band can become symbolic of all kinds of things and be a canvas for people who like that flavor to project onto that band in a way that an individual human being is much, they have to be, it's harder to do that, right? And it's harder for an individual performer to to maintain um, to maintain that kind of consistency. I think in terms of, I mean, there are like lower level reasons. Like I think, people will say it's harder to sell merch with someone's name on it because people don't like to wear a T-shirt with someone's name. I think there's like a deflecting, there's a helpful deflection that goes on with a band name for even for the primary person. So if they're getting bad criticism, like it is, even if you know that it's your project, it's much easier to read someone say, "Oh, such and such band sucks," than to read Franz Nicolay suck. Like that does hurt more. Or like
Well,
and so there's a comfort, I think, in presenting that way.
and you allude to this in the book, like famous example of Bruce Springsteen, firing the E Street Band, and he hires a bunch of new musicians, and maybe people didn't like the new songs, but there was a thing in the audience of like, it's almost like having a cast of your favorite TV show or something. It's like, this isn't the drummer I remember, this isn't the guitar player I remember, this looks weird. There is this almost like communal thing that an audience has with a band, even if they know that it's Bruce Springsteen songs and it's his music, but the band, it's like a cast of characters that's supporting him, and they don't want to see him without those supporting cast.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the other things that I spend a lot of time talking to people in the book about is this question of, is it better to be a good hang or a transformative musician, right? Is what matters more, your personality or your musicianship? And again, that's one of those questions that people came down equally strongly on either side of it. But a lot of times in that discussion, there's an assumption that of a band leader who's casting a band in the same way that a casting director might, for a certain kind of musicianship, but also for personalities that they want to spend time with. And one of the other fascinating things that about bands that form when they're young and then have to stay together over an extended period of time is these emergent personality conflicts that happen within a band without the band necessarily having the freedom to switch up personnel because of pressures from outside, because the fans are so invested in a particular lineup. Maybe these two members aren't speaking anymore and they're fighting all the time, but you can't just switch out the difficult person for a more malleable, better player, because there's these outside pressures that control for that.
Yeah.
And sometimes you don't even realize that until it's already happened. Like I'm not sure that I wonder if Slater-Kinney thought Janet Weiss leaving would be as big a deal for people as it was.
Right.
As
But
someone who was not an original member, right? Even in that case.
But then you have the bands, they lose the lead singer and then they put the drummer in, and then you have Genesis, they somehow carry it. So it's really
Yeah, I
strange
mean,
how there's, people can get replaced. Some people can leave and it's devastating. Other people can get replaced and, you can carry on. It's like, it seems very unpredictable sometimes, like what's going to work and what won't.
yeah. I mean, I think the examples that are the most iconic ones are iconic because they're more rare, right? To think about Genesis or AC/DC, it's like, oh my God, I can't believe they pulled that off.
Right.
I think like slightly more like one of the examples that I think is slightly more unusual is the drive-by truckers who have switched up lineups a couple of times, including core songwriters, and have managed to continue.
Right. Well, I could like dig deep into this stuff for a long time because I do find it very fascinating. But do we want to do the Q&A here
Yeah, we can
from
do
the
that.
audience?
Yeah, let's get started. I think the first question we had was from Mark Engelson. Mark, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, you mentioned how a lot of people, their impulse and their tendency is to write the same song over and over. I was wondering if you could talk about the distinction between repeating yourself as a songwriter and having what I would call a sort of sonic fingerprint, in that the songs may not be repetitive, but they are clearly from the same artist or band. I'd be interested in you talking about that distinction.
Yeah, well, I think particularly if you're a vocalist, you have less to worry about because most people's voice stays is going to sound the same. I used to talk about this within the Hold Steady, that we had a kind of freedom in the band because Craig's voice is so distinctive that we could do virtually anything behind him, and it's still going to sound like a Hold Steady song because the sonic identity of the band is his distinctive voice and lyricism. And I think you can. People talk about the transformations of a Bob Dylan or a David Bowie, but you're not going to mistake Bob Dylan's voice for anyone else's voice, no matter what's going on behind it. One of the things I asked people in this book, because I was interviewing people who aren't primarily known as front people, is the question of, do they consider themselves to have a distinct idiolect, a distinct flavor to their playing, or do they pride themselves on being chameleons? And I think in among band people, you get two kinds of people. You get the people who are trained and who are more likely to pride themselves. They went to a conservatory, or they went to an undergraduate music program. They went to these professionalizing institutions. And so they're much more comfortable not just thinking of themselves as professionals and being able to quote a certain price for their services, but also thinking of themselves as being adaptable to various situations, versus people who come up through punk and indie rock, who may either, two sides of the coin. Are they more insecure about their flexibility as musicians, or are they more secure in saying, hey, I've got this one thing that I do, and if you call me, you're trying to hire that one thing. And so in that sense, it's for them that ability to reproduce that one thing that people are looking for them is a feature, not a bug. If that answers your question.
Yeah. I think next we have Benjamin Tossig.
Hey, thanks. This is a really great session. I feel like I could listen to this for hours. I asked a question about theory specifically, and the gap between theory operates in the world of rock music songwriting and how it works in academic music programs. But I think I'm also just more interested in hearing you talk about the gap between how popular kind of circulates in academic contexts and sort of like what it is in the real world. Like this is something that's, to me, is really maddening about academic music departments. And, I'm just curious to hear from your position of expertise, like how those gaps like manifest for you and how you think about them.
Yeah, I mean, it allows me a little niche to fill, certainly here. I don't claim to say that the Bard music program is representative of academic music programs generally. It's certainly not. But there's many dozens of people working in classical music. There's a handful of people working in jazz. There's two electronic musicians, and then there's me, who is in popular music by and large. And so there's an imbalance between the kind of music that is specialized in by the faculty and the kind of music that the students are interested in making, which is by and large what I would characterize as art pop. And so being it's a real opening, being the person who can translate between that and the talents that are and the capabilities in the faculty. You know, it can be a little bit of a struggle, as I was sort of implying earlier about talking to students about songwriting, to get them to treat songwriting in the same way that they would treat taking a poetry class, and writing to prompts and writing to forms and talking about form generally. You know, if you took a poetry workshop, even if you're writing the freest of free verse, you're going to be expected at some point to know what a sonnet is and to have tried to write one, and Alexandrian, whatever these, you know, these obsolete or semi-obsolete forms. You take theory one, you're going to learn 16th century counterpoint, 18th century counterpoint. You're going to be expected to write a fugue and a canon. But those expectations in terms of talking about teaching popular music are not established in the same way. You know, like it's still I assume that when jazz started entering academic music programs in the 70s, that there was a similar lift in terms of what are the standards going to be and what are the expectations going to be. You know, as these genres of music move out of being able to support themselves commercially, but are still valued to some extent by the culture, and move into institutional situations and, you know, foundation funding, we have to figure out ways to normalize that and figure out what the expectations are going to be, and that can be a little bit of a challenge. I don't know if I lost the train there a little bit, but
no, I mean, it's great. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. I just I appreciate hearing from you about it. Thank you for that, and thank you for the talk.
I definitely emphasize theory as a songwriting tool, as a way to like work yourself out of a corner if you've and identify when you've written yourself into a corner, and then a way to get yourself out of that corner.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's great. I mean, I love that. And I wish that, you know, academic music departments could sort of see that use, because it's so different from how it's taught as like a fundament in academia. And it's cool to think of it in like playing other roles, right? Where it's sort of like more on the margins, like still important, but in a different position.
Yeah, I think the way jazz harmony is taught is a little more useful in the songwriting context, because it's derived from pop songs, right? And so it's a little easier to incorporate into that worldview. But also, you know, I'm telling people who want to go out and go into, you know, the kind of music business that we're talking about, that if you can acquire, you know, orchestration skills and arranging skills, and, you know, then you become immediately, but you still want to be in bands, you become immediately a really valuable commodity. If you can, you know, to do that Garth Hudson role of being like, here's what I think you're trying to get at. Like, I hear you're working your way towards this chord, and here's what I think it is, because I have this vocabulary.
Right. Or like George Martin or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Next, I think we have Michael Sonnenschein. Michael, you there?
Yeah, thank you. I'll be social and turn on my camera. Hi. First of all, I haven't actually had a chance to read the book yet because it just arrived, but so I'm excited to. So this might be repetitive, but I've been thinking a lot about, and I should have not used social science jargon, about how the Gini coefficient shapes band decisions. The Gini coefficient is basically the level of income inequality within a social unit. And it's something I've been thinking about because, you know, growing up, as I think a lot of us did in sort of like the punk indie scene, I would never think about how the people on stage might have very different economic circumstances. They might have very different outside options and might be making different amounts of money from the actual band because of songwriting or so on. And, you know, now that I've grown up and I'm a TV writer and I'm actually working on a show about an indie rock band. So it's giving me an excuse to like spend my time going to things like this. And it's interesting for me to think about how those affect sort of actual band decisions. You know, some members might have actual like outside options because they have fancy liberal arts degrees and other members don't. Some members are making more money from the records, if that is even a thing now, which I don't even understand, or, you know, than from touring. Whereas for other band members, like for it to actually, you know, they could go record another record, but they're not going to make any money from it because they don't own, you know, the mechanicals or so forth. So I guess I'm interested, and this is the classic, more of a statement than a question, and I should just shut up and read the book. But I'm just curious curious, like from an audience member, where I'm just going out to see a band I love, and I'm not thinking about that, like how frequently are those things happening under the surface, and how much of the decisions about whether a band is touring or whether they're recording or what they're, whether they're trying to like record something that's going to get sync rights, like how much does that sort of play in, and does that cause a lot of distress? And like pick your normative, fairly popular touring indie band, name here.
Yeah, it causes a ton of distress.
Right.
Adam Gopnik has a phrase that I've seen him use in more than one article about something about how every music memoir or story of music of band breakups ends up in the end being a story about song publishing, and it's pretty in the weeds. The legalities of copyright for the average music fan are hard to wrap your heads around, and it's not particularly romantic. And so maybe it gets under discussed, but it's obviously it's one of those things that creates a class system within a band the instant any money is on the table. And in terms of choices about touring, the person who makes the choices about, so I don't think I need to explain to anybody here that the songwriter front person is often the one who has the bulk of the songwriting royalties, which means that they have income independent of touring, right? And so they have less income stress on whether or not they're on the road. They're also the one who's usually the band leader and in the position to make decisions about when to tour and when not to tour. And so, if there's a couple ways that can play out, the rest of the band can either be on some kind of a retainer or salary, although that can, create stresses for a band to make payroll every month. You can end up taking festivals that are going to be garbage just because you need to make payroll, or experienced band people need to get really good at accounting and budgeting and scheduling. A band once they reach a certain maintenance level of success, I think Peter from the Mountain Goats talks about this in the book, is you can have a meeting at the beginning of the year and decide, because what your guarantee is, and it's by and large not going to get at a certain point in your career much bigger or smaller. You can meet at the beginning of the year and decide how much money everyone's going to make that year, and then book shows accordingly. You can work backwards from that. The tricky part is the band, on the rise, or I guess on the fall too. But the money is a lagging indicator behind the success. And so I experienced this with the Hold Steady. Like there's a couple of years where you can be a really prominent band and on the road all the time and not making that much money because that stuff comes later, or that stuff is tied to other things. And that, the famous examples are often ones where, people don't even understand what songwriting and publishing means. And so, you get a record deal, someone approaches a primary songwriter with a publishing contract, they say, great, they take the $100,000 advance. All of a sudden the guitar player, shows up to tour with Louis Vuitton bags, and the drummer still has his bartending job. Like this sort of things happen. Like this is the Robbie Robertson, Levon Helm thing, right? Like there's just a misunderstanding or a not understanding about what the legalities of songwriting royalty structure is. All that kind of thing is going on behind the scenes all the time.
Cool. Thanks for answering.
Thanks, Michael. Franz, I have a question that I think follows on that pretty naturally, but what I started thinking about when you were talking about not including personal stories and your own kind of memoirish stories in the book, which is, it seems like the way that you're stepping back here enables you to talk about the structural realities of how bands work in a way that in music talk often gets lost in talking about personalities and about the clashes between people. And I wonder how much you found, both in your process in talking to people and also just in the project in general, that it illuminated something about, things that people might experience as personal conflicts and not realizing that these are structural problems.
Yeah, I feel like I could take a couple angles on that. To your last point about things people experience as personal conflicts that are actually structural problems. I think that goes back to the previous question about songwriting and publishing. That's a structural problem. The problem of the old model of the songwriting team awkwardly pasted onto the collective songwriting of the band of the band in the post mid 60s time period, and that's just they just don't fit. That's a structural problem that becomes a personal problem. What was the first part of the question?
I guess the other part was like what you learned about it from the process and looking at the stories differently this way.
Oh, I mean, I think that the other, there are the structural problems. There's the ones about how about emergent hierarchies, obviously, are partially structural problems, right? Like it's easier for management to deal with one or two people than to deal with five people. It's easier for music journalists to talk to one or two people than to convene five people. Fans are naturally going to have more of an emotional connection to the lyricist for all kinds of reasons that are too obvious to get into. And so those are structural issues that are nobody's fault that can become personal problems. One of the generalizations I made around after talking to all these people is that bassists are by and large the most comfortable with their position and drummers by and large are the least. And I think there's, part of that is because drummers are structurally excluded from traditional songwriting copyright. They don't contribute lyrics, melody, or chords. And that's just, there's nothing you can do about that. And for the drummers who are savvy to that, that becomes a personal problem or something, something that eats away at it, unless they have a particularly generous band leader.
Catherine Jewell, I think you had next question.
Yeah, hi. This is super interesting. I wanted to ask a little bit more about the labor question and all of maybe the other ancillary forms of labor that go into the music making process and sort of, did you see any patterns? At first I was kind of curious about like the gender dynamics of the allocation of different types of labor within the song making process or just in the band management process. But I'm kind of wondering, like, beyond that, how, in the band house, like who cleans the toilet? Like, does that matter? Like, do these kind of X factors of the allocation of, who's arranging the catering, who's talking more like with the promoters and sort of the more kind of busy work of managing the business aspects of the band, where are people picking those skills up from? How does that play into this?
Yeah, there's a bunch of I asked everyone about extra musical skills, which they interpreted in all kinds of ways, but which I was really curious about about kind of what you're talking about, like who's driving the van, who's settling with the promoter, who's doing the merch, who's ordering the merch, who's got the health insurance, all of this aspect. And obviously on the sort of DIY end of it, and the beginning ends of bands, it sort of sorts out based on skills and personality. And I don't obviously some of that maps onto gender expectations too, both self-imposed and externally. I will say on that topic that I did, ask the women who I interviewed about their experience with sexism in the music industry, how they felt about, how that had played out for them. And the fact that they were so, by and large, with one exception, so adamant that it was not an issue, I think was just as telling as if they had said it was, because what it speaks to is that since I was interested in veteran musicians, is the sorting process that happens, right? That women who found the ambient sexism of the music industry intolerable were much more likely to just leave the business, and the ones who were able to accommodate and decide that it was not a problem for them were the ones who were likely to succeed. So, for good or ill.
Alex, you had a question.
Yeah, I basically just wanted to pick up on something that y'all were talking about in the conversation earlier with Steve about your theories about why people were willing to talk. You said that you had a few theories, and I just kind of wanted to follow up on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think part for some of them it was the novelty of being asked. I think for some it was the fact that it was me asking. I think, even for people who are experienced in talking to journalists, or even people who aren't, there is a caution. I think that I could ask them questions that signaled that I was sympathetic and sensitive to some of these situations that might only occur to another band person, like the dynamics of joining a pre-existing band, for example. All of that. And also, I think, because the people I was talking to, by definition, were people who were veterans. Because there's an unclear distinction in the under 30 set between people who are going to be professional band people for a career and the kind of semi-pro professionals and amateurs. I was by definition going to be talking to people who were a little bit older and a little bit farther along in their careers. And by the fact that they'd lasted so long, and a lot of times in these long-term collaborations, I assume they'd had a lot of these conversations with their band members and other band leaders. Like, I don't think they were saying anything to me that they probably hadn't said, no matter how critical it might sound. You do have these knockdown dragouts and these frank conversations behind the scenes in bands. And I can't imagine they would say they knew they were talking to someone who was going to write a book. And I don't think, some of that material, and there wasn't very much of that. I assume that wouldn't come as a surprise to the band leaders that they work with, for example.
Thank you.
And on that note, I think we should wrap up. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Franz, especially for joining us, and to Steve, who had to go and tend to his kids. Thanks to you. And just a reminder that we're back next week, not in 2 weeks, unusually, for Trisha Romano and Michelangelo Amatis talking about the history of the Village Voice music section. So let's all reconvene at that time. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.